Before I start the presentation, I have three comments. One is that I'm no expert in this field at all. I've had a passing interest in it for 50 years, but I didn't study it. I didn't even read the book on it. I knew about it a little bit, and I thought it was fascinating what the topic, which we'll get into very shortly, pretends to say in science. So I thought it would be interesting to give a talk here to a technology group. There'll be nothing about computers in this, very little, if any, physics. There'll be some biology. It'll be mainly sociology. So we're going to branch out in this computer group a little bit today. Secondly, it's a controversial topic. When it was first proposed, it became very controversial. Geneticists in particular, sociologists, psychologists, ethicists, and particularly religious leaders didn't think that this was a topic that should have any academic credence whatsoever. So they really fought against it, and that still goes on today. It is still talked about in some genetics departments. So there's a little bit that goes on all the time. Since it was first proposed, there's some research done in it, but it's sort of coming in from left field to right field, adding more, taking away more of some of the concepts that we'll talk about. But it is quite controversial, and I think you'll see why as we get into it more. Thirdly, I'd like to not have any questions or discussion while I give the talk. Otherwise, we're going to get down to the weeds real fast, and I'll never be able to finish. So please write notes, put in chat or something like that. What you want to talk about, what you want to present here. So first, since most people don't know what the topic is, I'll start off with a definition of it. As Edward O. Wilson, who is the founder of this field, I'll get a little bit more into the background of how it was founded, defined it as the systematic study of biological basis of social behavior. So let's stop and think about that for a minute. He's a person who wanted to study social behaviors, and I'll get into why he did that for his whole academic career. But he was trying to look at social interactions, social beings and behaviors by all animals, including humans. And he said there has to be a biological basis for this. By biological, we mean today, and back then he thought about it somewhat, but not as much as we do today, genetics. How much does our human or other animal genetics bias or cause social behaviors? That is, how much does genetics, which is transcribed and translated into proteins, which thus are translated or are the basis for how we are formed and perhaps how we think. That's what we're talking about here. A little background. I got interested in this when I was an undergraduate in college. My girlfriend at the time was a physics major, and she transferred to zoology as a junior. And she took a course in animal behavior. I'd never heard of it before. And it turned out there were two faculty members at the school who were doing research in animal behavior. So I got interested because I learned some things about animal behavior that I had never knew before. And that's what is really the basis for my interest in this topic. And it turned out that in 1973, three people got the Nobel Prize in physiology or medicine for their work in animal behavior, of all things. It was given to these three people, Carl von Frisch, Konrad Lorenz, and Nicholas Tinbergen, for their discoveries concerning organization and elicitation of individual and social behavior patterns. That's a long reason for why they got the Nobel Prize. And it's a very, these three people did a lot of work in various areas, which laid the foundation for what we call today animal behavior, but what became known about the time that they got the Nobel Prize as a field of ethology. So if you ever heard of that term, that's what that is. Animal behavior and ethology mean the same thing. Now let's go in a little bit to what they did so you can see, hopefully it will pique your curiosity about what animals do. Okay, von Frisch, he was the one that did the bee investigations. So there's a lot of writing that I put in here. I'm just going to have you and all and me go through a lot of the writing together, and I'll try to amplify what I've written here. I don't know the field that well, so I have to rely on this, and I have some notes that I'll get to later on. Okay, von Frisch, Carl von Frisch investigated how bees communicate information, and it was apparently genetically programmed and not learned. That's a key thing. It's from genetics, not something they've learned from their environment. What happens in the bees that a returning bee, it's a female, has been out, has found nectar, that's going to come back and tell the rest of the hive that there's nectar out there. So this bee performs what's called a round dance. Other bees, again, females, participate in the dance with her. They just go round and round in circles in the hive. Then they go outside the hive and they circle around the hive to find that source. Now, if the source is more than 50 meters away, there's a different kind of a performance by that first returning bee. She performs what became known as the waggle dance. That is what she does. She lowers her abdomen to the hive and she waggles her tush forward as she moves forward. We call that twerking today. She moves forward. While she's doing that for a short distance, she turns to one side, comes back to her starting point, does the waggle up to that point again, turns the opposite direction, comes back to starting point. It does that several times. Now, how does that tell the bees where the source is? The movement is upward at an angle. So think of the hive top as being the apex of the hive. And to the bee, that top of the apex is the sun. So the bee thinks of this as where the sun is. And so what she's doing is she goes in a direction, an angle to the top of the hive, and that's the angle from the sun in which the source is located. Now, if the sun is not visible, then the analysis done by polarized light, that is, the sun gives off polarized light that comes through clouds and so forth, bees can sense that, and they know that's happened. Now, how far is it? The intensity of the dance tells them how far it is. More intense dance, it's closer. Less intense dance, it's farther away. So they know how far they should go, perhaps, to find the source. They have a good direction to find the source. Konrad Lorenz. Most of you, I'm pretty sure, have seen some things that Lorenz has done. He studied what's called instinctive activities, that is, irreversible behavior patterns, instincts. We'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to use these terms quite a bit as we go on. In birds, by specific what's called key stimuli, that was his term, key stimuli, these birds were naive. That is, they took the egg that had been laid, it took it away from any other source, allowed it to hatch and see what kind of behaviors it would have. So it had to be something that wasn't learned. It had to be something that was inborn in that bird. He used ducklings. So what he found was that a duckling, when hatched, will follow any moving object, whether it's the mother, whether it's a cardboard box or a balloon. He did experiments on that. Any of you who have gone down to the center in Boston have seen, Boston Common, have seen that ducklings, the mother's in front, all the ducklings are behind. You see that. That's why the ducklings are behind. They follow in a line. They follow whatever's in front of them. That's how they get there. It's by this instinct that they have. Tinbergen analyzed elements and strength of key stimuli which elicit particular responses. Um, he delved into more and more of kind of a little bit more abstract thinking about animal behavior. So he was again probing what these instincts were and how they were changed and so forth. So what he did is he worked with seagulls, and what he did is he made seagull bills out of a variety of materials. As I say here, various forms, various colors, and various contrasts between colors. And he did that to see how the parent seagulls fed their offspring. And he found that he could elicit various behaviors from the parents, depending on what he did with the colors, forms, and the contrasts. Finally, the latter awardees, as Lorenz and Tinbergen in particular, studied the overlap between genetically based influence on more nuanced behaviors such as courtship and reproduction. They were interested in how animals court with each other and what happens during the reproductive or copulation or fertilization stage and so forth. Tinbergen in particular found inherent courting, mating, and young rearing behavior in stickleback fish. And if you want to get into that a little bit, I've got some notes on how he did that with the sticklebacks. Now, before I go on, I want to give a brief review of genetics, because if it's true that genetics is the basis for behavior, we got to know a little bit about genetics to see how we can probe that. I'm going to do the human here, but like I say, this whole field is for all animals, all sexually reproducing animals. Human genetics, there are about 3 billion base pairs in a human nuclear reference genome. That's what's called an HNR. The HNR was first proposed or first put out around 2002. It was never perfectly done by that time. In 2017, there was an update. There's been updates all along. The most recent one I know about is 2022, and it still isn't perfect. I can go into why that is, but I'm not going to do it here. Okay, so with that genome, none of us have the same genome. We all have mutations, and we all are acquiring mutations all the time. Most of those mutations are corrected. In the DNA, we talk about base pairs. Now remember, DNA is a duplex. So we're talking about two nucleotides that are attached by hydrogen bonds to each other to form a particular area, or a particular nucleotide base pair. That's why we call it base pairs. The reading is only on one of those strands. So it's kind of confusing to those who are not immersed into biochemistry. So when you see base pairs, think of it as only one of those is the one that's being read. Like I say, there's a variation of about a 1 in 1,000 base pairs. So if you see that with 3 10 to the 9th, that means we've got a 3 million mutations, and we're all different. In the human genome, it's a little bit controversial how many genes we have. Right now, it's around 20,000 genes in the human genome. It's about chimps have almost exactly the same. In fact, the chimp genome is very, very similar to ours. There's very little difference between the chimp genome and our genome. So a particular gene varies in size from 500 to 2.3 million base pairs. A wide variation, but the average is about 3,000. So the average gene is 3,000 base pairs long. There's 2 times 10 to the 4th of those. So you can see that there's very little of your genome that codes for the DNA of your gene. Most of the genome does not code for the DNA of a gene. Now, let me talk about what a gene is. It was thought, and I'm sure when you went to school, that the gene was what coded for a protein. Today, that's changed. That definition has been altered somewhat. We have found that genes are transcribed by messenger RNA to make messenger RNA. Messenger RNA polymerase to make messenger RNA. And what they have to do is they have to recognize some places on the genome that are areas that tell that particular protein to recognize that gene and to transcribe it. There are a lot of those areas in the genome. It's been found, let me think. Let's see. Yeah, it's probably 40% or more of your genome is taken up with these. So we're learning more about what the genome is. But now the genome, so a gene has the gene for the protein plus whatever those areas are. And they're pretty small. There may be 10 nucleotides in length. And there may be several for a particular protein. And they may occur on different chromosomes. Most of them will occur on the same chromosome as that gene, but they could be on different ones. So we're learning a lot more about biochemistry of genetics. Secondly, let's talk about meiosis. I think most of you have probably had this in some biology course, but you probably forgot. I forgot what it was. But it's very important, particularly for the genetics of organisms. Meiosis is a way of forming the gametes, that is the sperm and the eggs for humans. And I'm going to talk about more from a human perspective, but any animal that reproduces sexually has gametes formed in this manner. Now, if you look at the picture I have up there, you see two light blue and two dark red figures or things in that figure, different forms. They're different sizes, and what I've done, or what we've done in this picture, I didn't make this, but we did in this picture is have two chromosomes that were the homologs. That is, one came from the male parent, one came from the female parent, and you know that that's what happens when you're formed. You get one from the male, one from the female. So we've done two chromosomes here to show you what happens. In the first part of meiosis, called interphase, those chromosomes reproduce, that is, they duplicate. So now you have two forms or two pieces of the same thing of each chromosome. And that's what we show here. They're duplicated and they're formed out of what's called a synapse. You see that parallel bar there. Those are called synapses. And it happens on both of the chromosomes from the male and from the female. In meiosis 1, what happens is that those homologous chromosomes actually come together very close to each other. And when they do, there is actually crossover that occurs between the chromosomes. So what you have is three things can happen. One is what's shown here. You can have a transfer of DNA from one chromosome, let's say from the male to the female. And obviously the female then transfers her part of it to the male. Another thing that can happen is you can actually have a break in the chromosome. So you actually lose part of the chromosome. And the third thing that can happen is you can add to a chromosome. So the male might add to the female chromosome. That's not as common as what's shown here. This is much more common where you get that exchange to occur. So when you get into meiosis 2, now those synapses separate. So now as you see on the diagram here, you've got 4 possibilities of chromosomes that now are very different from what you as an adult have in your genetic code, because you've got a lot of this crossover to occur. That crossover is called meiotic recombination. On average, for humans, there are 33 recombinations per chromosome per meiotic event. That is, for every meiosis that occurs, there are about 33 recombinations of this type that occur. Those recombinations often occur about the same spot on the chromosomes. They can be different. It can be Um, not at the same place. It could be different positions. So, but more often than not, it's around the same place on all of them. So you can see by this and by the fact we have mutations all the time, it's very difficult to study genetics and to try to get hierarchies of genetics. In other words, where you came from, where your parents came from, and so forth. Within a matter of 10 generations, we've lost a lot of the information, but we gain information too as we do more studies on this. So that's where the genetics background comes in. All right, now let's go to the actual topic itself. Sociobiology started with Ed Wilson. I call him Ed. Ed Wilson. He came from a poor family in Alabama. Mobile is where he was born. He went to school at the University of Alabama, got his bachelor's and master's degree there. He came to Harvard to get his PhD in genetics. Subsequently, he stayed at Harvard and became a very esteemed professor of entomology. What happened during his early life is he had a fishing accident, and fishing hook got caught in his right eye. Now, this is back in the 1950s, 1960s. So ophthalmology was not as well along as we are today. So the surgeries that were done on him were not very good. And subsequently, he lost the lens in his right eye. So his right eye has maybe 10 or 20% ability to visualize structures out there, but he can't read or anything like that. He can't focus at all. So most of his work is done with his left eye only. And that's for his whole career. So that's why you see him with that right eye, pretty well closed, because it's not being used that much. Ed Wilson lived in Lexington. Maybe some of you knew him. His daughter, he and his wife had one daughter. I don't know whether she went to Lexington High School or not, but he lived there sometime. I had seen him give lectures, two lectures on the subject of sociobiology. So I knew what he looked like. And back 15 years ago or so, I used to do a lot of running. Not a lot, I did some running. I'd go 4 or 5 miles. And I used to go from house we lived in into Lexington Center, go through Lexington Center on the sidewalk down Mass Avenue and return. And one day, as I was going down Mass Avenue, I see this guy and his wife walking toward me, and he had on a typical hat for a zoologist that goes out in the field and does studies. And I said, "My God, that's Ed Wilson. I didn't know he lived here." Yep. And so I went back and looked. Yeah, sure enough, that was Ed Wilson. He lived here most of his life. He died about 2 years ago in Burlington. Now, I assume what happened is that they moved from Lexington to Burlington into some sort of a retirement area, something like that. His wife died, preceded him by maybe 3 or 4 years, and then he died like only two years ago. He died. Ed Wilson is a very controversial figure. The book and most of what my talk is based on this book. The reason is that sociobiology, he was the one that kind of founded it along with a grad student of his. He wrote this book. It's a textbook, but it's a textbook any of you in academia know about review articles. That textbook is really a big review article. It's mammoth. It's 700 pages. I've got a copy here. I'll show the group. Maybe you can see it. I don't know. The big book. It has two portions on each page, and the printing is very fine. So there's a lot of words in there. And if you try to read it, you're going to fall asleep quickly. It's tough. His writing is very pedantic. It's tough. He's controversial in the field. When he first proposed it, he got a lot of controversy from geneticists. However, he's extremely bright. He's got a lot of knowledge, and he really delves into all animal behavior from all aspects of it. It's amazing what he's put into this book. He wrote several books. This copy is the first edition. It was in 1975. There was a reedition in 1980, I believe it is. I didn't see that one. This is the 75 edition I have. The 1981, I don't think was too much updated, a little bit, but not a lot. He wrote another book called On Human Nature in 1978, which received the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. So he's a very good writer, and he has a lot to say. In his lectures, he was very opinionated. The book is very opinionated, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why most geneticists, most academicians do not like the subject, because his opinions are very strong. When he writes, he extols the virtues of some work by some of his colleagues. At the same time, he denigrates a lot of the work that his colleagues have done and how they have interpreted and so forth. It's loaded with that kind of information. So you have to read it from that perspective. It's tough.
Nobody. All right. The video they're seeing is clipped a little bit. I thought maybe there was something going on, so I can't change it. Go ahead. Sorry.
This is exactly what I'm saying.
No, I know. But they're seeing.
Oh, what they're seeing is not this?
It's clipped a little bit.
Oh. Well, it's what it is. Yeah. Okay. So, like I say, he's a very controversial person. So when he gives a talk, he gives it very forcefully. And when questions come up from the audience, more times than not, if they're questioning his research and what he's saying and so forth, he pounces on them. Anybody who's comes from an academic background has had some time in academia as faculty members or postdocs quite a bit. You see this all the time. This is very typical in academic circles for people like that. Academics is extremely political, more so than politics, I think. But anyway, that's my perception anyway of it. Okay. All right, let's go on and we'll amplify this a little bit more. All right, now we're going to get into the guts of sociobiology as I have tried to glean it from there. I'm going to try to give an overview. And hopefully I don't lose you in this because we're going to get a lot of concepts here that are not common to most people. I'll try to amplify and write questions or something like that so I can go back and try to further define some of these concepts and so forth as we get on. Wilson has 2 or 3 definitions that he's given to sociobiology. One of them is the extension of population biology and evolutionary theory to social organization. Now, the reason that he has come up with this definition is because back when he wrote the book in 75, most zoologists were studying evolution, and they were studying population biology, how populations grow, what happens to them, how the environment influences what they do, and so forth. Now, he wanted to take those 2 subjects, combine them, and see if he could study how these populations organize socially. Most organisms, most animals do have social organizations. Okay? If you've done any kind of casual reading whatsoever, I think you see more and more that biologists are finding this to be true. Fish, termites, mollusks, obviously lions, tigers, hyenas, gorillas, chimps, form social organizations. And so do humans. Okay, now, A, all individuals in animal societies possess 2 traits, self-preservation and altruism. I want to really focus on that. If you leave here with nothing else, This is one thing I want you to take with you, think about for a while, and see if it's true or not. I happen to think it is true. We're all born with two instincts, self-preservation and altruism. Let me give you an example I've come up with. It may not be the best example, but hopefully it gets across the idea of why this is true and maybe cements it in your mind of why I think it's true. The example is this. Let's assume that you're in a dinghy out in the Massachusetts Bay. You're out there with two other people, your offspring and a friend of your offspring. Now, a wave comes up and tips over the dinghy. Now, you guys were stupid enough not to wear life preservers. So you're thrown into the water without a life preserver. What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Save yourself. You're going to fight to the surface. You're going to look for the dinghy to hang on to. That's your first instinct. That's an instinct. That's what you try to do. What's the second thing you try to do? Okay, you've got two other people in the water. Who is it that you're going to try to save first? I think the odds are you're going to try to save your offspring first. You're also going to try to save the other person, but the first person you go after, the first person you look to is your offspring. That's altruism, saving others. Altruism is two people interacting in such a way that they bond or kin with each other. These two traits are central to the beginning of sociobiology. Those traits override consciousness and they drive your actions. So we do have instincts. We don't understand them perfectly. We're constantly trying to find out what they are, but that's what sociobiology is all about, trying to figure this out. Secondly, and these concepts are coming from the sociobiology book. What I've done is I've tried to update it as I understand it from the book. Like I say, the book is 50 years old. I should say there have been no textbooks written on the subject since then, per se, that I've been able to find. There have been a number of books that have been written. The first one that came out attacked his ideas here, and it wasn't well received. And since then, there have been a number of books that have come in from, let's call it left field, and gone in some actual topics that he talks about there. Not the whole field, but some topics he talks about there. So on and on, we've gotten books that have been published all along, even until today, that are kind of ancillarily get to this topic of sociobiology. Okay, so behavior is natural selection. Natural selection is from evolution. It's a Darwinian concept. Natural selection means that you select for certain genes, and that's how we evolve. We'll get into a little bit more about how that happens as we go on. So, for example, now thinking of this from strictly a biology genetic standpoint, we say that the DNA of the individual goes to mating. We have instincts to mate. From there, we go after mating, we have offspring. So not we, but all animals have offspring, and they care for those offspring. That's an inborn trait. You try to care for the offspring. You all know as parents how you have a sort of a natural affinity for your offspring. It's just there. You didn't necessarily learn. You might think you learned it from around, but it's an instinct that you have. And finally, from there, we go to altruism, where it's all the rest of society in your group. You have a feeling for these people. You have a kinship for those people. So more and more complex interactions of these genetic products, whatever they are, often cause altruism, that's big down, particularly in humans, to override self-preservation. So these two concepts kind of fight against each other all the time in animal behavior, in animal societies. The self-preservation maintains your genes so that you can reproduce. So you go on, your genes are going to go on. In fact, that's what the gene is there for. The gene is there to reproduce itself. That's the purpose of a gene. It's not to get you, it's to reproduce itself. We've had, the pandemic with the coronavirus. The virus is there to reproduce itself. That's its only function. All bacteria reproduce themselves. all organisms, the whole purpose of the organism from a biological standpoint is reproduction of itself. Now, what happens when you get into this area is altruism is also not part of our functioning. And altruism can override that self-preservation thing. So you've got this constant battle that's going on between the two things. So what happens is when altruism goes on, often it's done so that you perpetuate the species by forming populations. And in animal behavior, in animal studies, that's what they talk about. They talk about populations of animals. So, for example, chimps in Africa can form troops. And these troops are various populations, small number, that go together. Animals have prides. Okay, elephants form, there's a name for that, where the mother is the dominant feature person in that. And I mean, this happens all the time in the animal field. Fish do the same, whales do the same. All animals do the same thing. They form populations. Not all. Many of them don't have that. And we'll get into some of that difference a little bit later. Now, from a biological basis, for humans, your emotions are controlled by your hypothalamus and limbic system. These terms are probably not too familiar except to Jerry. The limbus and the hypothalamus are two anatomical features in what's called the midbrain. The midbrain is part of your brain, or part of the brain, let's say of humans, which is very evolutionarily old. It's in the central part, lower central part of your brain, and it controls your emotions. The emotion centers are there. Now, the cortex has some influence on it, and the hypothalamus and limbic system, also the amygdala, also have some function on the cortex. So there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of research being done in these areas now. But more and more, we're coming to believe that those two features, and Wilson knew this at the time, they are the basis of your emotions. So if that's true, this means that the genes which underlie embryology to form the human, they must underlie your conscious and unconscious behavior. That's the basis that Wilson is saying. So let me give you an example of that. Let's do a comparison. And this is something that Ed did. Ed's research was on ants. He was called the ant biologist. He studied ants. He went all over the world studying ants, various colonies. There's lots of difference in the various ant species all over the world. And he was the one that really understood this well. So let's talk about termites and monkeys. They all have a communication they communicate with each other for hunger, alarm, hostility, caste status, or rank. That is, they will communicate with each other telling you where the source of food is, or that they are hungry, and so we got to go out and do something. If there's a predator around, they sound the alarm. If there's a predator around, they also form another form of communication to show hostility to that predator and maybe force the predator to go away. And they also know where they stand in their caste. So, for example, in the bee population, you have the queen. She lays all the eggs, and she's been fertilized by the males. The males themselves are they don't have all the chromosomes. They don't have a full set of chromosomes, so they die. They all die. The females have both sets of chromosomes. So what happens, the females do all the work, except the males do a lot of the work inside the hive. They'll take out the garbage. And like I say, they fertilize, they help keep the young growing in the hive and so forth. So there's a caste. That is, the queen's the top, the workers, and then the drones. Now, the reproductive status in most animals is by 10, or in these two sets of animals, is from 10 to 100 non-syntactile signals. That is not touching. In other words, we communicate by voice. We also communicate by hearing. We also communicate by vision. You see other people's facial features, the way they move and so forth. We're communicating that way. Termites and monkeys do the same thing. They often, well, the termites in particular, and also the monkeys, have pheromones. These are chemicals that are given off by the body, and they are signals that are picked up. We have pheromones too. That's being studied, and we're learning a little bit more about that. That's off and on as being a major way we communicate, but it's still there. There's an awareness of by individuals of the distinction between your group mates and non-members. So, for example, a lion pride knows when there's another lion that's trying to come in and get part of that group. And so they recognize that's a non-member. It's an innate trait that they have. So they try to keep that non-member out. Termites do the same thing. The termite if a termite from another area, another, what would they call those things? Mound comes in. They really fight that termite and keep it away. So kinship is important. Labor is divided. Like I say, there's castes. They have different roles. And the fruits of the cooperation depend on particular conditions of the environment. In other words, your environment or the environment of these animals really controls how this kinship goes on. I think most of you, including myself, think of it in terms of humans. But this really goes on with all animals. The environment really changes how we respond. We're coming into a situation now where we have global warming. How do all animals respond to that? How do we respond to it? We respond by trying to change it. Animals, they can't change it. Other animals, I should say, they can't change it. So what they do is they will move. That is, they will emigrate. They will try to find other food sources if they can, and so forth. And we'll see that genetics plays a role in that. Now, finally, in this particular slide, I'm saying that Wilson thought of sociology more from a social evolutionary description rather than from a molecular biology perspective. When he was writing this book, this is 1975, and we didn't know a lot about molecular biology back then. In the 1970s, molecular biology was just beginning to take off, and it was done by studying of bacteria. We knew that bacteria have genes, and we knew that there were promoters and enhancers for the gene being produced and so forth. That was the beginning of all this. It was thought that higher animals didn't have promoters and enhancers, but now we know that's not true, that there's even more of that's going on in our genome, which I just talked about a half hour ago or so. So environment has a tremendous influence on, molecular biology perspective. So Wilson was trying to put it into perspective of sociobiology without knowing much about molecular biology. The genome had not been solved for the humans. Like I said, that was 2002 when the first one was published. We knew it was there, but we didn't know what it was. So he had very little information on that, but he had a little insight. Some of it's wrong, but he had a fair amount of insight, which I found pretty much is still true. So one of the difficulties of acceptance of sociobiology is the presence of hierarchies, where dominance doesn't occur, but higher levels of control levels do. Hierarchies is where you have somebody at the top and you have various levels coming down. So, that's a hierarchy. And usually dominance is one of the key features of hierarchies. That is, the person at the top is dominant. Bad example is in our presidential election, the president is the top. Okay, legislature second. Well, that's not true legally, but we think of it like that. And then we, the people, are down at the bottom. All right, there are hierarchies and there's dominance in there, but sometimes there are hierarchies where you don't have dominance. In those instances, there are often few social bonds and loose communication abilities. In those animal populations where that occurs, those bonds are not strong between the two. So what happens is you have populations that go off on their own. This happened in the human evolutionary trait field when humans were evolved. They often went off as single families, and they just went all over the place. They didn't communicate with each other. Eventually, populations formed as they reproduced, and more they came, and they saw that they had to get together to harvest plants or have animals that they could herd and so forth. Other animals do the same thing. There are other animal species that do the same thing. They go off on their own. And there's a hierarchy there, but that hierarchy is very loose in there. Like I say, these people do not communicate and so forth. And at the end here, I say, if you're humans, there are many social bonds. We bond with lots of different social groups. And we have a very rich communication compared to other animal species. We have probably the highest of all of communication abilities compared to other animal species. That's what makes studying sociobiology in humans extremely difficult. Because you got, like I say, altruism versus self-preservation. You've got all these other things going on and how we function. All right. Now I'm going to get the next two slides. I'm going to go into some of the things that Wilson put down in his book to give you a flavor for kind of how difficult it is to study this subject. The first topic is called Societal Qualities for Organized Study of Social Changes and Adaptation. That's a tough sentence to try to understand, but let me go through some of these concepts here and give you some idea of what he's talking about. Remember, he's trying to get population biology down into societal studying actual societies of animals. So he's trying to make a broad category of topics to which we could do research on and try to nail down what this really means. So one of the areas that they study is group size. Now I've got some notes here, and I'll try to use these notes to amplify what I'm saying on the slide here. Primates form groups. Lions form prides. We form societies. We form groups. There's a demographic distribution. That is, there's a frequency of individuals with specific traits or roles. Hang on a second. Yeah. In a given population, there are, let's take the bee population again. There are many more workers, females in a beehive than there is either of the other two members of that caste. There's only one queen, lots of workers, and far fewer drones. So the frequency of those people, of those individuals, changes. And they have specific traits or roles. They have certain roles that they play. They do certain things. They have different, let's say, instincts, in other words, the way that they interact with their environment and do things. The topic or the area of study of cohesiveness. Honeybees are quite cohesive. They form very strong groups. If you ever tried to take a wasp nest out, which I did this last summer, you can get stung very quickly. Okay. They are really connected to each other. If one sees you out there, man, the whole swarm comes after you. They're cohesive. Chip troops are less cohesive. They interact with each other a lot. Some chimp troops will actually have neighbors come in and interact with them. Sexually, sometimes they actually interbreed. Not a lot, but sometimes do. So they're much less. So cohesive is another area. The fourth area is the amount of pattern of connectedness, and pattern of connectedness called types. So types of communication networks. Connectedness is usually done by communication within animal species. How much communication? and the types of communication. That's what we're studying here. We communicate a lot. So we have a high amount, we humans have a high amount of communication. How we communicate, like I said, we communicate mainly by speech, either written or oral, but sometimes by sound and sometimes by visual. Other animals have some of that. Some have some more than others. Dogs, for example, are very good with nose, pheromones, so forth. They're extremely good with that. They communicate with each other. Any of you are dog walkers know, and when you're out there walking your dogs and you come up with another dog, one of the first things the dogs do when they see each other is they sniff the behind of the other dog, right? Yeah, they're communicating. They say, well, is this dog a friend or foe? Is it male or female? What's this? It's an instinct they have. Okay, so there's lots of different communication. Permeability, another area. That is, how easy is it for individuals to move between groups? This is based on whether the group accepts other individuals into it or does not accept other individuals into it. If it's accepted, like I say, some chimps move from one group to another. If it's accepted, then you can have gene flow, because what you've done is you've taken an animal from one area, moved it into another area. If they copulate, you're going to have gene flow from that one that moved into the new group. So you got genes that are different now. As we'll see a little bit later, that means that the genetic code for that individual is much richer and can adapt to the environment, perhaps more easily, or perhaps less easily, depending on what the genes are. But at least that there's a change that can occur. Okay. Intolerance means that you're going to have less gene flow. So any change in evolution for those groups that are intolerant is not going to have the advantage of new genes, but perhaps the mutations that have taken place will be enough so that they can take advantage. So this is something to study, how much of that goes on. It's tough, but that's what you can study. Compartmentalization, that is how these groups organize when responding to dangers, Wilson's approach here. So, for example, I gave the wasp thing here. When they organize, there's a danger. They sense I'm outside, I'm going to take the nest away. They organize very quickly, and it's a very strong way that they organize. They organize as a group, as a society to come after me. They're going to sting me. All right, that's what they're trying to do. So there is an organization very quickly. Other animals do the same thing. Whales, for example, often if there's a predator coming after them, depending on the size of the whale, they actually will bond together and try to force that predator to go away. I think someplace here somebody talked about what happens when you have starlings and a hawk flying together. If you see that, the hawk obviously is going after a starling. They want to capture the starling and take it for food. When the starlings are together, they usually are in a fairly loose formation. That is, they're not close to each other. If the hawk is below them, they stay in that loose formation. However, if the hawk goes above them, they will band together and form a very tight organization. So that when the hawk comes down to try to get one of the starlings, often one of their wings of the hawk is going to get crippled by hitting one of the other starlings. And so the hawk is going to perhaps lose totally. It may get that starling that it went after, but it's going to probably die eventually from having a broken wing. Starlings do that. That's an instinct that starlings have. All right. So that's a compartmentalization. Wait a minute. Am I differentiating roles? Is that where I am? Mm-hmm. Did I do that one? Okay.
No.
That's
You're on 7.
Okay. Yeah. That's, yeah, the differentiation of roles. Yeah. So, yeah. So let's talk about the specialization. Um, Another thing that happens is there's usually an optimum mix of specialists in groups, and that's done for efficiency of the group. The group is much more efficient in how they carry on their activities as a group if they specialize and have only certain members there and only certain proportions of those members in those groups. Okay, number 8, integration of behavior, where you have a group of journalists versus a set of specialists with correct individual proportions and with coordinated behaviors. That is, you can have certain animal groups that are generalists. They can do everything. We humans can do most anything. So we're generalists, pretty much. Going back to the bee population, they're specialists. They have only one role: lay eggs, fertilize the eggs and keep the honey comb in good shape, or go out and get nectar, get food for the source. See, that's what happens in the integration of generalists versus specialists. So that's another way of studying. Finally, information flow. So you have a communications that go on between them. And what Ed Wilson did is he said you could have you can study the total number of signals that goes on between individuals, and you can have the amount of information, and what he said was bits per signal. So a little bit of computer, maybe. Bits per signal, that's communication. Okay, so he talked about that. That's the amount of information. We can have the rate of information flow. We studied that. That is the bits per second per individual. Or we can have bits per second per the entire society. So for humans, the whole society is putting out a lot of information. So again, that's bits per second per entire society. So that's another area that is of study. And finally, the fraction of time devoted to social behavior, that is the degree of sociology, is directly proportional to the time spent on individual social behavior. What that means is that we as individuals do things as individuals. All animals do the same sort of thing. But in terms of their societal behavior, the way they form societies, the way they function as societies, the behavior of societies is directly proportional to how the individuals spend their time on that interaction that goes on between members of society. And different groups do it differently. We spend a lot of time at it. Other animals, a lot of fish, for example, don't spend much time. Mollusks don't spend a lot of time at it. A lot of other, what we call lower organisms, don't spend a lot of time at social behavior. They don't form societies where you interact a lot. So that's another area that one can, or that people study. You can see from this that this is a tough area to study and to try to nail down what the differences are, and thus try to get the genetic locus for those behaviors. It's really hard, but there's work being done. Okay, next big subject here is evolutionary theory applied to sociobiology. Yeah, I think I'll finish and give you time the questions here. All right, we're going to go first of all to adaptive. This is another area that Wilson talks about, evolutionary theory. So we're going to go into evolution now. First was the social part. Now we're going to go to the evolutionary part. Adaptive versus non-adaptive traits, one area to study. Traits that maintain the population by selection can be either non-adaptive by selection, non-adaptive, or otherwise. So adaptive means that the population is maintained by selection. That is, we adapt to our environment. That's adaptive. Other animals do the same thing. They adapt to the environment. How much food is there? What's the climate like? What's the weather like? What are the predators like? What's the prey? Obviously, the food and so forth. That's adaptive. Otherwise, it's called non-adaptive. A trait can be both, by the way. For example, in humans, we have the sickle cell disease. It's a single genetic mutation. And it has both a favorable trait and a non-favorable trait. Favorable because it keeps you from getting, is it yellow fever? Malaria, yeah. Keeps you from getting malaria. Obviously, the other is sickle cell. So the hemoglobin collapses, forms clogs in your arteries and so forth. And it's, eventually kills people. So you got both traits. So that's a toughie. But you can have these adaptive traits that can be both positive and negative. Just give you an example. Third, reinforcing versus contracting selection. So you have natural selection force in a gene may multiply from individual to family to troop to population. That is, when natural selection acts on a population of individuals, often an individual reacts to it. In their reaction, they often interact with their family. That family interacts with the troop. I'm talking mainly about monkeys here, and then to the whole population. So that expands how the selection occurs. It occurred on the whole population, but the way that it gets adapted is maybe one particular individual has a gene that selects for that particular trait. If they copulate with someone and those individuals those offspring have that trait, they will adapt more quickly. Eventually, the families obviously will form that adapt. The families then try to communicate and so forth with other people that have the same traits that happen to have the mutation. Excuse me. So they form troops, and then the whole population does it. And this is a way in which groups of animals shift in adapting to that environmental stimulus. Ultimate versus proximate causation, another area. So, for example, senescence or natural selection, which takes generations to manifest, is balanced against an individual's anatomy, physiology, behavior. A prime example of this particular instance is the human, particularly the human female. Human females can only reproduce up to a certain age. I said before that the whole purpose of the genome is to reproduce. So that the human female has gone to a certain age in her reproductive capacity. But we all know she lives a lot longer than that. So she has no use to biology from that standpoint, but she certainly has a lot of use to the population. Okay? So natural selection, I don't know where that's going to go. But certainly with humans, it's gone to the point where you don't have to be able to reproduce to still maintain your significance in the whole population. Ideal versus optimum permissible traits. A very good example of this is the horn size of a mountain sheep. Ideal is to keep the hair. All right, you got a big horn, you're going to keep that harem in the mountains together. Okay, if they try to go off, you're going to come in, you're going to nudge them with your horn, bring them back to the troop and so forth. However, you're on a mountain, so that horn is big and it's heavy. And so as you move your head, it tends to tip with you, okay? Or it may hit something that's on the mountaintop. So it's not very good. So the mechanical stress is not in its favor. So that's the thing. It's optimum to have a horn of a certain size. The ideal is to have a big one. So anyway, that's just an example what you can get with the ideal versus optimum. Potential versus operational factors. The growth and persistence of population depends on the genetic-based ability. Let's see, okay. All right, the genetic-based ability, okay. Availability of mutational factors on subsistence. That is, how easy is it for the individuals to subsist on their nutrients in a given environment? It leads to the growth of the population if they can do it And how they do it is because of genetics. In other words, if you can subsist on less nutrients, you can live in a particular environment much longer. The population can exist much longer in that. We're undergoing that in the human population to some extent right now. You may not be aware of this totally from this perspective, but that's one reason why we're getting lots of immigration, because there's lots of population, particularly in Africa, in the Middle East, in South America, and so forth, that can't subsist. So they're moving, and they're moving because they can't subsist. And perhaps some of those, if they had an easier way to subsist on what's there, they might stay there. But this is one example of things that are going on with the population, and it's because of the genetics. Deep versus shallow convergence. And this is deep convergence. This is talking about particular anatomical features that animals have. And whether they have converged into various species. So, eyes. Mollusks have eyes. You may not have known that, but that's true. They do have eyes. Most vertebrates have eyes. I can't think of any that don't have. And that really influences the behavior of those organisms. Shallow convergence is when it's a shallow, that is, not many of the organisms have the convergence, leads to territoriality and dominance for many species. Because they can't communicate, they have to really keep their territories, and they can't change very much. They aren't able to move as quickly, they can't adapt as quickly, and so forth. So they become territorial, and they really try to dominate that territory so other people can not come in and take their subsistence away from them. Number 8, grades versus clades. This is something new to me. I'd never heard of a clade before. A grade, from an evolutionary standpoint, this is pretty simple. Most of you have seen this from Darwinism. Evolution goes through grades. That is, for example, for humans, we came from hominins, came from Africa. They moved north through the Middle East, came into Europe. Some went back to Africa. And then the actual human formed in Africa, came back up into the Middle East, and then went to the west and to the east. That's how we did. And when that was happening, we evolved into the various areas, Australicus and so forth. Various forms happened until we finally got to our form, which is, several 100,000 years ago. That's a grade. Vertical evolution. Now, clades are species that are split into forming new species, that having the same traits as each other. So you have a particular species at a particular level of evolution, and what happens, something happens to that particular species, and so they split off and they go on their merry way evolutionarily in a vertical direction. The other one stays here. It maybe goes off and evolves, or maybe not. Maybe they die off. But what had happened to form the clades is you get different organisms that are at the same level, and they just happen to split horizontally. That's a clade. Finally, instinct versus learned behavior. Instinct has a genetic component. So, for example, the male silkworm moth is attracted to female sex hormone. That's genetic. That was not something learned. Learned behavior is a very response of primates to speech patterns. Okay, we all know about that. That's something you learn. We're not very good. Speech is horrible as far as I'm concerned, because it has many aspects to it, and we don't understand it well, and we're very bad at our communication versus speech, I think. So, anyway, it's a very response to speech patterns, and we're very good at that aspect of it. And that's a learned behavior. You learn by your parents, you learn through your teachers, you learn by interacting with other people. All right. Heredity. I don't want to talk about this. This was some of the math that Ed did. It's not very good. I just thought I'd put it here, but I'm going to go to the last slide because it's 1:15 right now. I want to get some discussion. The one thing I will say about this, the top part of it is just the binomial distribution. That's having two genes coming together. You get homozygous, heterozygous, homozygous out of this. And you got two heterozygous for one homozygous. Bam, so heterozygous is going to dominate eventually. The bottom one is a differential equation. He actually put a differential equation in here for evolution of gene frequency. And what it says is that how it evolves depends on these features. P sub x is the number of genes of gene X, which is the one that's causing the evolution over the total number of genes in alleles. Allele is a place on a chromosome where the gene resides. That's what an allele is. When you see that term, that's an allele. It's really a gene, but it's a gene on a chromosome. That's an allele. R sub x here is the change in the number of that good, let's call it good mutant over the total number of those mutants, how fast that's changing. R0 is the total number of changes that are occurring in all those alleles. And so P sub x turns out to be the frequency of the gene, okay, as I put up here. R sub x is the fitness of the gene, is what he called it, of gene X, and R0 is the average rate of increase or change of all alleles. When I looked at this, I said, strictly from a differential equation standpoint, I have problems with it. And that's particularly with the R0, because what if R0 goes negative? That makes that turn positive. Well, to him, it's always going to be positive. So anyway, all right, this is the last slide. Heritability. We're going to talk about phenotype variation depends on the gene differences and environmental variations during individual lifetimes. Phenotype, that's what's presented to the outside world. That's what a phenotype is. Any organism has a phenotype. You and I have our own phenotypes. Phenotype is really the generation of us from our genes. The genotype makes the phenotype. So in biology, a phenotype is what the organism is. Individuals can have different heritability scores in different environments, even with the same genes. That's kind of interesting because heritability is something that is the ability to inherit something from your parents and so forth, and how you can adapt to your particular surrounding by that heritability. You can have what's called a heritability score, in other words, what your genes are causing to form. And you can exist in different environments, positive and negative, depending on those genes. So your score, how good it is for you to adapt to changes, can differ depending on how that environment changes. It can be positive in some cases, negative in other cases. Speed of evolution is defined as the heritability times the intensity of the selection process. That is, how strong that environmental change is. People who lived on the side of volcanoes found that out. Okay, Pompeii, they found that out, right? Okay, evolution had to be pretty damn fast there because they're going to get swallowed up by the lava that came down on them. Lots of selection that occurs. We have other selections that occur, and that happens through all the animal kingdoms. Cyclical selection can occur where favorability of different genes depends on environmental changes at different times of organisms' life with concomitant selective pressures. So what happens here is that we adapt in various directions, and animals adapt in various directions depending on the genes. And it might be that those genes become unfavorable under different environmental conditions. And those organisms that kept the old genes maybe can adapt better to this new environmental influence. So you can get the cyclical selection process. It makes, again, the study of this whole field very difficult because you've got these various selection attributes that are causing problems in how you analyze. It's very tough. Finally, human evolution. I figured we want to talk about humans a little bit here. All right. Humans have evolved to have, and this is unique to humans, they've evolved to have erect posture. We're the only animal that has erect posture. We have bipedal locomotion, 2 legs, 2 feet. We have an enlarged thumb, helps us to grasp things more than any other animal. We have a lengthened leg, helps us to walk. We have a narrowed and lengthened foot, again, helps us to walk. We mostly lost our hair compared to other animals. I'll give it to you why we did that. Some of us males, of course, we're losing more. Females have a change estrus cycle compared to other animals, other mammals, even chimps. Their estrus cycle is very different from other animals. And finally, copulation is initiated by foreplay in humans rather than pheromones or skin color changes in other mammals, including chimps, orangutans, gorillas, and so forth. So we copulate by foreplay. Other animals don't do that. There's a little bit that goes on, and you think that, but when you stop and look at what's going on there, they're really responding to pheromones. Our human brain volume has greatly increased to where our mental abilities, for example, intelligence, drive, creativity, communication, our social interactions, and so forth, have gotten really big, tremendously expanded. Humans have it, no other animals have that kind of mental abilities, and a lot of it's due to the fact our brain size has happened. Anthropologists have really cemented this idea, and I think it's very true. We have much more mental ability than any other animal. We barter and we reciprocate with what's called reciprocal altruism. That is, I'll do something for you if you do something for me. That's led to our formation of two very human endeavors, economics and law. We're the only animals that have those particular social interaction abilities. No other animals have that. Humans have developed what we call rituals, culture, religions, and ethical values. Mysticism. Now, some animals supposedly have a little bit of that, but that hasn't been well documented yet. It may be true, but I haven't seen it to be really there. But we do. We conduct all kinds of rituals. We have our own cultures. We have our own religions, various religions. We have ethical values. That's how we can maintain societies. And finally, sexual selection rather than polygyny may have fostered human evolution. Now, polygyny is when one male has several females. And this is very true in, let's say, lion populations. Let me see, gorillas. A lot of animal species have polygyny. We don't. Well, I should say.
Except for Utah.
Yeah, let me see. Yeah, maybe I should back off a little bit about that. Anyway.
As a general rule.
As a general rule, very good. Okay. And it could be that that's fostered human evolution, because what happens is that particular male will have more offspring with that particular female. So what happens, you get that genetic line that goes down through several individuals. And that may help in fostering the human evolution, because if you go back to what I talked about in the genome, with all these changes that occur in meiosis, you got all kinds of changes that go on, but you're kind of keeping it in that particular vertical line. So it might be that helps in our selection process. Okay, now with that, I'm going to close. Man, I stopped later than I thought I was going to, but what I want to say is that next week, I'm down to give the first part, I think, of that talk. And what I want to do is to update you on what we know about humans. There was a book published in 2022 about humans from a sociobiological standpoint. I want to get into the genetics of that. So the first maybe half hour next week, I'm going to talk about that. Okay?
It's yours.
So with that, floor is open.
Well, Wilson's stuff were sort of, I guess you could say, opinions written by him. And there wasn't a lot of proof, right?
Oh, there's a lot of proof. If you look at his book,
maybe behavior.
right?
But
You mean genetic?
Could that be redone with what we now know about DNA and look at all his well, maybe not all his stuff, but a good portion of his stuff in view of what we know about DNA?
Yeah, that's a good question to get right to the foundation of what this field is today. The answer is, like I said before, Wilson didn't know about that stuff with the DNA. We know a lot more about it. And what the problem is that DNA is much more complex in terms of heritability than people knew, that he knew and that people know about. So it's a difficult field to try to probe. Next week, I'm going to give you what is up to date in doing what we know about DNA. Some of the studies that have been done trying to get the genetic locus of specific behavioral traits that humans have. Now, doing that to other animals, as far as I haven't seen anything published on. I'm sure there's stuff done because I don't follow the field, but it's a very difficult thing. And so people are trying to do it. Yes, they're trying to show that. And that's what makes this field so controversial, because people haven't been able to show, like I think you're intimating, that genes really do control social behavior. Because that was his main contention, that biology controls social behavior. And that's controversial today. It was very controversial back then, but people slowly but surely, there's not a lot of work done in it. As far as I know, I don't know if NIH giving any grants on that, NSF maybe, but there's not a lot of work that's done on that. But the little bit's being done, a few people are probing it, but it's very difficult. But yeah, there is some work being done. It's going to be tough. I don't think in my lifetime I'm going to see really definitive stuff out. But more and more, this is my personal opinion, I think we're going to learn more and more that genes do have an influence on it. The problem with humans in particular is that we are so altruistic that we interact with each other a lot, and we change our behaviors on our interactions because of that. Not because of our genes, but because of the interactions that go on with us talking to you. So it's difficult to separate those out. That's always been the problem with the field. We'll see. We'll see but I happen to believe that genes do have a role in it. Ted had a question here. I want to get him.
Would you?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, Jerry.
Go ahead, Ted.
Well, go ahead, Ted.
Yeah, you have to
unmute
unmute yourself.
Please. No, nothing.
You're not,
Okay,
there you
am
go.
I
There we go.
unmuted?
Yeah, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, sorry about that. Couple of things I think are interesting in this context, and they just popped up as you were going along. Back in the early part of the 2000s, the IEEE Boston section, when I was working my way up through the Politburo to become the chair, decided to see how the engineering community could basically do something with respect to biology, because biologists were sort of trying to repeat experiments that had been done many years before in engineering. And we, in fact, found them trying to create something called systems biology, which was, in fact, something we had a lot of experience with, is the communication systems. And so we put together a brief lecture series, which we called Enginomics, because of, well, we just wanted to create another name. And we got a number of brilliant top of the line speakers to come along. And the keynote speaker for this thing was Eric Lander, who was the director of the Broad Institute, and who had been originally a mathematician whose expertise was in statistics. And after he finished his talk, we had a discussion session, and I asked him the question. I said, well, how come you didn't do the canine genome first? And he said, well, the problem, of course, is to get the money for it. But that, yes, he always wanted to do the canine genome. Of course, now you can buy a kit and do your canine genome anytime you want. But he agreed that the variability that we see in the canid species, of all the related species, canines, is most dominant in the entire, well, biology world that people know of. You can take a dog that you can fit in the palm of your hand. It's called a teacup chihuahua, and it can sit between the ears of the largest dog. And while mechanically might be difficult to breed them, crossbreed, they certainly can produce fertile offspring, maybe by some mechanical means. That said, we try to understand how we made dogs out of wolves, and under the tutelage essentially of Lysenko and Stalin, there was an experiment accidentally conducted in Siberia with foxes. Arctic foxes were of great interest from the standpoint of the economy, because you could sell their coats to people for hats and things. But it was a pain in the ass to have to go out in the countryside and hunt foxes. It'd be nicer to be able to breed them. So they tried breeding foxes, and the experiment was basically put a fox in a cage and then stick a human hand with a glove on it into the cage and see which way the fox reacted. And if the fox was pretty much neutral to the hand, that fox was retained. If the fox was negative to the hand, then that fox was thrown back out into the wild. And if the fox came and sort of attracted to the hand and then maybe attacked the hand, they weren't sure. But they continued that process of sieving through the fox behavioral characteristics for a number of years. I've forgotten exactly 10, 15 years or something. But the problem was that in addition to finding foxes that behave like dogs, they also found foxes whose coat colors changed and whose tails changed. And it didn't take very many generations. Let's say maybe they did 2 or 3 generations a year, possibly, maybe 1 generation a year. I don't know. They didn't keep really careful records. They just kept on keeping the foxes that were the successes of the experiment, except that they all turned out to be failures. So that was an accidental experiment, and those are always very interesting. We have other accidental experiments now that what we've done with coyotes or coyotes. They've basically come in and replaced wolves, who had been the dominant predators in many areas, because we hunted the wolves, but the coyotes were able to come through from a reserve in the west and dominate the entire country now. There are many coyotes in Lexington. I have coyotes traveling on my street right in front of my house on a weekly basis, certainly, sometimes more frequently than that. So how do all these things interact in different ways? Environment, human activities, and populations that adapt in various ways. And I think dogs have been extraordinarily successful at that. And one last vignette that somebody sent my wife, and I saw it. There's a woman somewhere, I don't know, Michigan or something like that, who basically is a dog walker, but she got tired of having to pick up individual dogs in her car and things, so she bought an old school bus. And now there's a video of this. I'll find it and put it out. The dogs come to the school bus stops, sit there waiting for the bus to arrive, obviously with their owner, managers, or whatever. They get on the bus. Each one has an assigned seat, and they ride to the dog play area like kids do. And then they go home and they get off the bus where they're supposed to get off. They know where their stops are and everything like that. Now, that's sort of a mixture of instinct at some level, but it's also very much adaptable behavior. It's not genetic, of course. Dogs don't know anything about school buses in their genome, but they've adapted in some fashion. Will that pass to the next generation of dogs? It's hard to know.
Thanks, Ted.
Yeah.
Jerry?
A little more briefly,
Any
the,
comments by anybody else?
Yeah, Ted, we have some comments in the, in here.
in sociobiology, I think there are grades, plays and finds. In, the grade is vertically in by time temporal, the grade, the plane is geographic. For example, the scrolls on the north side of the Grand Canyon look pretty much like the scrolls on the south side of the Grand Canyon, but they cannot reproduce their different behaviors. And then there's a climb where you take a frog like Rhinopiblins in Maine, let certain behaviors of reproduction, and they can mate with ones from successfully both from New Hampshire. Ones from New Hampshire can mate with ones from Massachusetts, and so on down to New York and then down to Florida. But the frogs in Maine cannot mate successfully with the frogs in Florida, and their behaviors are completely different because their environments have evolved. They've evolved differently for their own environments, and that's called a climb. So it's very gradual.
Okay, did you people who were on Zoom, did you hear Jerry's comments?
Not at all, not too good.
Not well.
Okay, let me try to summarize, okay? Because I have the only speakers, well, speakers here, I guess. What Jerry was pointing out is that there's a third gradation between grades and clades, and the third gradation is a cline. And what he says is a cline is an organism which can reproduce with itself. It can reproduce with a species close to it. Okay, it's the same. It's the same species. Yeah, you're right. It's the same. Well, it's a cline species then. Okay, so it's a species very close neighbor, and it can reproduce with that one. Then that particular species can reproduce with another cline species, which is in a different environment. These environments are different. So on down the line. And the point that Jerry is making, which is a good one, is that the first species cannot reproduce with the last species in that cline.
Yeah, ultimately,
That's
the
a very
changes
different-
get significant
Yeah,
enough.
that's what's happened
If they're insignificant to begin with.
in terms of
ultimately they're
reproducibility.
significant.
Yeah, that's been bred out, genetically bred out in that cline. They've gone
Whether it's
differently. Yeah. Yeah, again, it shows what happens genetically in organisms. So, another question, Michael? Yeah,
thank you.
thanks, Mike.
And you can't mate with anybody with that.
It's true.
So I got involved with Black Panthers, and I'm not a radical. But the Black Panthers were friends with somebody who was in the medical school. I don't even the whole thing. And this topic of sociobiology came up, and it was a very, very hot topic and really fearful topic. And it was part of not so much San Francisco as in the East Bay of San Francisco, which is more.
Yeah, yeah.
And this was in what year?
This was like 1975.
So the same time period.
So this is Berkeley area. Yes, yeah, yes.
And don't talk about this. This is racial discrimination. You can't do anything with it.
Yeah.
Very big topic. I just want to bring it up. It's a little off topic.
No, that's good. I don't know whether you heard this on Zoom, but Mike, is it? Mike, yeah.
Can you okay, good part.
Can you guys hear the audience comments on
No,
Zoom?
we can't.
Okay.
We can't.
Okay, let me try to again paraphrase Mike's comments. He's a physician who did his medical training in California, in the San Francisco area in the 1970s. And the topic of sociobiology was a hot topic out there at the time. In particular, in the Berkeley area, UC Berkeley, as you all know, I think most of you were alive in 75. Berkeley was a hot area in terms of radicalization. I mean, there was a lot of stuff going on there against the Vietnam War. And as Mike points out, the Black Panthers were a very strong influence out there in San Francisco at the time and so forth. Well, what Mike says is that when the topic of sociobiology came along, the Black Panthers got up in arms because what they're saying is that you're talking about racial discrimination here. And what you're saying is that that's something that is genetically determined, that racially we're very different and therefore we got to keep our place and so forth. Yeah, that's one of the reasons why sociobiology didn't take off in the 70s, because of the fact you have the racial aspect. The other thing that has struck me all along is you have religions, and religions do not like the idea. Most religions do not like the idea that genetics dictates how we behave. All right. I think some of you go away and hopefully some of you have thought about that as discussion's gone on. There's lots of things. What happens, let's say, the things that are going on, the fact that the women now are becoming more and more strong in their economic, political force in society, in American society. Again, that's something that they wouldn't have liked back there when you talk about that females have their own genetic component and they're supposed to be destined. Yeah, that's something that has been said about sociobiology. Ed Wilson never said that. He never, ever adopted that point. A lot of his detractors sided with him on this point because you had all these other people who would come in and just really lambaste him on the thing, and his detractors defended it, said, look, Ed's not talking about that. That's not what he means by that. He's talking about a big field, a big area, how genetics controls behavior broadly, not putting people in place. Now, what's happened since then, as we've gotten these things together, is that something I alluded to before, is that we as human beings really do have a lot of control over how we function as societies beyond instincts. And we do it a lot now. And we see that in how we have integrated, say, different racial groups, how we have integrated more and more of male, female, and so forth. It's much more that happens that way. Now, it does cloud the field somewhat. In other words, when you take one side or the other, you kind of close your mind to the other side. But I think you got to keep both sides open.